When you adapt any book to TV or film, it's hard, almost impossible to translate every character from page to screen. It may be because their role is very minor, with little impact on the main story, and in some cases, there can be important characters in the book whose involvement becomes defunct due to choices the writers made when adapting the story, perhaps streamlining storylines and removing some altogether. For me, Game of Thrones started to do this a lot more after season 3, with the first character being cut who I really missed being Val, the wildling princess, with Tormund taking much of her role in the show. In terms of the cutting of storylines, you also have people like Arianne Martell from the Dawn storyline, and really interesting and complex characters like Jon Connington, another point of view character, and quite a big part of Tyrion's storyline in Essos, and who is going to have a huge role to play in the Winds of Winter. The showrunner's choices to change or remove these storylines resulted in these characters not being needed in the show. It was obvious when it came to House of the Dragon. The same thing was going to happen to some degree to some characters and storylines. However, with Fire and Blood being a fictional history book, where we mostly know a lot of the characters on a more surface level through their actions and what people said about them, it did give the show the freedom to mold them to the story they wanted to tell. However, there was one omission from season 1 that really did ring alarm bells for me. In the build-up to the premiere, when the full cast of the season was confirmed, and as we watched the show each week, my worries were sort of confirmed in a way. It appeared that the show had cut Alicent Hightower and King Viserys' youngest son, Daeron Targaryen, also known as Daeron The Daring, a fan-favourite character from Fire and Blood. While we know that in Fire and Blood, in the year 126 AC, at the age of 12, Daeron is sent to Old Town to serve as a cupbearer at the Hightower, which then leads to his involvement in the Hightower army's march across the Reach, and his vital role in the first and second battles at Tumbleton. His actions during those battles are, in my view, very important to the plot, and removing Daeron would impact these events greatly, and ultimately diminish two of the most bloody, horrific, and also interesting battles from the Dance of the Dragons. The little we know about Daeron paints him as an exciting and interesting character, who I think fans would love to see on screen. So yes, when I first heard that Daeron had not been cast, my assumption, like many others in the wider fan community, is that he was at Old Town, thus why would they need to cast him for season 1? But then, House of the Dragon came out, and when we had the time skip, introduced Alicent and Rhaenyra's children, and then the time skip which aged them up into adults, I was very surprised that in the show there isn't even a mention of Daeron, or any allusion to the fact he exists at all. No throwaway line by Alicent or Otto about Daeron being away in Old Town, or even a mention to the fact that he also has a dragon, something that is a vital war asset for the Greens, given they have fewer dragons than the Blacks at the start of the war. Now, I believe the writers chose not to mention Daeron simply because adding in another silver-haired dragon-riding Targaryen prince, when there's already so many characters in the show, would simply overload the average viewer with information that is simply not going to be relevant till much later on in the story. So much changes during these time skips, with many years passing between each. The viewer is getting a lot of new information thrown at them very quickly. They have to be able to keep up with it. Minimizing that information as much as they can is perhaps why the writers chose not to mention Daeron. I do think it's a shallow excuse and assumes the average viewer is not really paying attention, which I don't think is fair or true, but I can understand the logic. The issue is they spent no time at all in season 1 setting up Daeron, so when he is hopefully introduced in season 2, like Ryan Condal, the showrunner, confirmed in an interview in October last year, I can't help but feel it's going to be very jarring and almost out of nowhere and slightly at odds with the rest of the story. I feel the same about the lack of build-up in regard to Aegon and Helena's children. Namely, we've hardly spent any time with Jaehaerys or Jaehaera at all, or seen them really interact with their parents that much. And much like Daeron, their youngest child, Maelor, has not even been mentioned yet or alluded to at all. As a result, the show is going to have a lot of work to do to correctly establish those characters and their relationships and make the viewer care about them very quickly during season 2, if key events such as Blood and Cheese are going to carry the impact they are meant to. I worry the same will happen to Daeron, but I'm hopeful they'll have much more time to deal with him than they would in the case of Jaehaerys and Jaehaera, and blood and cheese. But there was some signs they still intended to include Daeron at some point in the show. In the opening title sequence, during the section showing the family trees, showing the bloodline of Alicent and Viserys, it clearly shows them having 4 children. Thus, when they were making the title sequence, it was clear they still had Daeron in mind.